Good evening, everybody. My name is Omane Abu, and I work for the City of Glendale Water Services Department. Joining me tonight is Joanne Toms, who also works for the City of Glendale Water Services Department, and Melissa Cruz Peoples, our guest presenter. And the topic for tonight's class is on the basics of seed saving. Before diving in, let's go over some webinar logistics. Attendees are muted and the class will be recorded. The recording will be available on the city's water conservation website and YouTube channel in about a week. You've already been testing the typing or the chat features, so you can type your comments in the Q&A or in the chat function, and Joanne and I will try to read and respond to as many as we can throughout the webinar. The class is scheduled to be 1.5 hours long, and we've allotted about an hour for the presentation of roughly about 30 minutes for questions. We will aim to stay on track as we want to be respectful of your time. And if you should experience any significant technical difficulties, please contact Joanne Toms via email or phone. Her email is jtoms, jtoms@glendaleaz.com, or you can call her at 623-930-3596. And after this presentation, we'll follow up with an email that includes a copy of the PowerPoint, the resources, recording, and the link to the survey. And if you complete the survey, you'll be entered in for a chance to win a gift card from a local nursery. So please fill that out. We really value your feedback. And just to go over some additional Zoom attendee features, this is what your screen might resemble, and you can play around with the features so you're comfortable. You can click and drag the vertical bar in between the presenter and the presentation to enlarge or shrink the presentation view. You can also adjust the audio settings in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And again, feel free to send comments using the chat button, or you can share your questions using the Q&A button. Joanne and I will be monitoring those throughout the presentation, but we should have enough time at the end of the presentation to do a Q&A portion. And I would like to highlight a few local seed libraries that were included in the reminder email. So you can get free seeds at the Phoenix Public Library, Maricopa Community College's Native Seed Library, and the Glendale Public Library. So just adding some information about the Glendale Public Library, at the seed library there, adults can take home and keep up to 3 different types of seeds every 7 days at any of the 4 public library branches. So that includes the main library, Velma Teague, Foothills, and Heroes. And then seeds are sourced from Native Seed Search and provided by the Glendale Water Services Department, Conservation and Sustainable Living Division. So it's never too late to start your seed collection. So there are some resources available if you wanted to get some free seeds. And I am very excited to introduce to you our presenter tonight. So Melissa Cruz Peoples is a garden education and seed saver. She currently works for the Arizona State University Garden Commons at the Polytechnic campus, as well as the owner of The Desert Smells Like Veggies, a vendor of organic, locally grown garden seeds and plants. She is co-author of the book Saving Seeds in the Southwest, written during her time working as the Seed Conservation Director for Native Seed Search in Tucson. She loves helping gardeners at all skill levels learn how to grow. Everyone give a virtual round of applause to help me welcome Melissa Cruz Peoples. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Melissa.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate this series that's going on. So. You want me to get started?
Sure, I'll stop my screen share.
All right, so I'll share my presentation screen. I have lots of slides. Yeah, so I'm stopping yours. Or did you show your slides on my?
Yep, I'm good to go.
Okay, gotcha. So, sorry, it's asking me to kick off your sharing. So, and you can see that, right? Okay.
Good.
Making sure what I see is what you guys can see. So thanks again for having me. I love talking about seeds, and I think there's so much potential with saving seeds and really building up our local seed supply. And especially in Arizona and Phoenix, you know, it's a tough place, right? And so the more locally adapted seeds we have, the better gardening, the better agriculture, the better things we have. Because we're not Minnesota or Idaho are big seed producers in the country, and our climate is very different. And so our local seeds are going to be more adapted to our local environment. So there's a little overview of what we're going to cover in the workshop. You know, we have an hour, but I do want to take the time at the end for any questions, or feel free in the chat to write them as they come to you. Too, and I'm glad Joanne shared my email. I'm happy to answer questions and troubleshoot any things that you have in case you need to log off early or have something that come up later. Just feel free to reach out to me via email too. And so you all may have your reasons of why you're interested in saving seeds. There's lots of benefits of saving your own seeds. First of which is free seeds, right? You're growing plants anyway. You may come across plants out there on hikes or in the environment too. And so we want to keep those seeds going. And gardening, increasingly so, is an expensive hobby, right? There's a lot of expenses with soil, with water, with amendments, and fertilizer, and seeds, and plants too. And so it can add up. It does seem that gardening is more economical than the grocery store nowadays, but we can use our successes in our garden to get sort of the next generation and free seeds. Also, by saving our own seeds and working with others who save too, you have access to a whole bunch of other stuff that isn't necessarily available when you go look at the seed rack at the store too. And so really hard to find things, rare things, things that have a history or story in your community and are known to do well too. You can get by connecting with local seed savers. And I'll kind of reiterate over and over again about how locally saved seeds are adapted to local conditions. And that's so important in our desert environment in Phoenix. If something actually did survive our 120-degree days, you know, very little rainfall, like intense conditions, it's going to carry with it those genetics, that genetic memory of how to survive in harsh conditions. And so one way to think about seeds as little time capsules. They hold with them the memory of every season they were grown. And so if they're grown in an environment that is ideal, which, you know, let's say is the Midwest is more ideal, really rich native soil, getting all the nutrients it needs, ample water, ample sunlight, not too much, you know, just really nice conditions. If that's all those seed lineages have ever been grown in, when they're thrown in something like the Phoenix area that doesn't necessarily have great native soil, not a lot of nutrients, more nutrient poor, high salt content, intense UV sunlight, extreme temperatures, nighttime temperatures of 90 degrees. It has no memory of what to do. And so those seeds and those plants just don't know what to do. But over time, as we save from things that have experienced those conditions and survived and thrived, those seeds are holding more of a memory of how to live. I'm curious too, a lot of us from all over, but I haven't lived in Phoenix my whole life. And it took me the first few years a while to kind of get used to it here, right? And so same with our seeds that we're growing too. It takes some time to kind of get used to things and used to like those conditions as well. And so a lot of seeds in the seed packets that are available commercially, you know, have instructions and have planting information and things for not necessarily the Phoenix zone, zone 9 B, and sort of what our conditions are. Even zone 9 isn't really describe the Phoenix conditions either, and when we need to plant things to be successful. And then of course we're also dealing with climate change too. Our monsoon season is coming later and later in the summer, or not at all coming, so that predictability isn't there. And so by growing seeds locally, we kind of adapt to those conditions. And I'm not sure how many people are sort of consider themselves a new gardener, which is great, but the COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted this, of how many people were thinking about food security and, you know, the lack of products in the grocery stores, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, and the rising cost of food things too. And so seeds definitely were impacted by that. The number of gardeners skyrocketed. at the beginning of the pandemic in that spring. And so seeds were very hard to come by. Seed companies had to shut down to deal with all the excessive orders that were coming in for seeds. I still have a hard time finding some things that I've been wanting to trial and grow. And so, it's not always a given that you can just go online and order what you want. These resources may not be available if you want them. So kind of becoming more independent, more food secure, more seed secure, of having those skills of how to save your own seeds and keep it local in the community. Here's just a diagram showing the impact of loss of diversity with the Green Revolution in the 70s and just more commercial agriculture and things too. The diversity of different varieties has drastically decreased. And you can see that too. If you go in a grocery store in Phoenix and you go in a grocery store in Ohio, what's available in the produce section is pretty much the same stuff. And some of that's being grown in the same location. And so, where in the past 100 years ago or so, every little valley, every little region had its own like local food, different varieties, their own local cucumber or their own local acorn squash and things. And so we've lost a lot of that diversity, which means we've lost a lot of those genetics too, that flexibility and that adaptability as well. And so with the rise in gardening and the heirloom seed movement, and a lot of these local treasures have been rediscovered and are getting out there, and there's more diversity in seed catalogs today than there necessarily was 20 years ago, because of people like us who are interested in all these cool and unusual varieties, but also varieties that just perform well and do well. And so we're not all eating the same thing, right? We like all the weird blue tomatoes and unusual things that you can't always find in the mainstream seed catalogs. So and I kind of talked about this too, sort of the reasons to save seed is really to save that diversity too. So we don't put all our eggs in one basket. We grow lots of different diverse genetics that can adapt to climate change, can adapt to extreme conditions and there too. And so also a lot of the diversity is wrapped up with cultural and ethnic diversity as well, and celebrating all these different foods or different preparations of foods and things too is wrapped up in saving different seeds as well. So first off, what do we want to save? We don't necessarily want to save everything that we may choose to grow in our garden or everything that we may see growing out there in the environment. We want to carry on the genetics of things that are positive genetics that we want to keep going. So we don't want to take things that are from diseased plants. We want to take seeds from healthy plants. Good tasting things. There's no use to me saving something if it doesn't taste good, right? And I don't mean like things like, you may not like kale, but some people do like kale. And so you want to choose kale that actually like tastes good. And so you may not be interested in saving kale if that's not one of your favorites, but we want to save those varieties that actually are good. And I see a lot of recommendations when someone has something, oh, I didn't really like this, I'm not going to harvest this. And then someone chimes in and says, oh, just save the seed from that lettuce. But if you didn't like the lettuce and it didn't taste good, or it didn't grow well, or it bolted really quickly, which means going to seed, then don't save seeds from that lettuce. It's not the types of genetics you want to keep promoting and carrying on. And so particularly for our Southwestern region, we want things that are adapted to our arid conditions, are pest resistant or fast maturing, highly productive plants like as well. And so we also want to save those family treasures or those memories that you have with growing something in your garden. Maybe this was the first beefsteak tomato you ever got to actually harvest. And so saving seeds of that is also saving that joy that actually getting that giant tomato brings you too. And so I don't come from an agricultural family myself, but my great grandparents and aunts and uncles were all farmers. And I hear these stories about how my great aunt was a pea farmer, and she grew so many peas and was so successful at it that she was able to buy the first Model T truck in the whole county. This was in Nebraska. And she did it while raising 15 children. She had this little side business to grow peas, and was so successful, she bought the first truck in the county. And so everyone, looked up to her and thought this was amazing. And so I would love to have those family peas, just to continue on that story and that legacy of that. And unfortunately, we don't have those peas, but there are many stories like that. I would love to have my grandfather's bean peas and his turnips that he would always grow and talk about growing too. And so having these skills of how to save those seeds keeps those memories kind of going as well too. And so those are important things as well. And it's so fun when you save your own seeds then to share with your community, share with your local library. Over time you can give something your own name and treasure that too. And so that's important parts of the seed saving story as well. Sorry, I got kind of off there. So the next couple of slides, I'm just going to go through some basics of different kinds of seeds that are out there. And this is information that kind of goes beyond just what seeds to save, but are just good skills and good things to know when you're shopping and looking at seed catalogs and kind of demystifying some of all these different labels and things that are out there. And so most seeds, garden seeds, whether it's flowers or vegetables, things too, are classified as open pollinated seeds. And these are what people have been growing for thousands of years, since people have been saving seeds. And so that basically means the seeds themselves are the results of natural pollination that's related to the botany and the genetics of those plants. And those seeds, lineages over time, they breed true to type. If they're allowed to not necessarily intermix with other varieties of the same species, they'll resemble the parent plants. So what you see is what you get kind of with open pollinated plants. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you won't get some cross-pollination or creation of frankenfruits or things that are kind of mixed. And we'll talk more about what that means. But it means there's no like sort of scientific process or unnatural process that creates the seed or the offspring. And so as a seed saver, if you save from open pollinated seeds, what you see is what you get. The parent that you're growing will produce the child that is like the parent. And so heirloom seeds, which many of you are probably interested in, are a subset or a type of open pollinated seeds. Heirloom seeds, there's no like one definition or agreed upon definition with heirlooms, but the idea is that they're old, generally like several generations, 50 years old, for example. And as a grower, like those are often like tried and true, like there's a reason why they've been around for 50 plus years is because they're good varieties. And so open pollinated and heirloom seeds often have a lot of diversity kind of within it, where it's not all the plants that grow from those seeds aren't necessarily all uniform and exact and have some weirdness to them, different root shapes or things too. And so as a commercial grower, if you were growing to sort of for your income, to have things to go to market, whether it be the grocery store market or the cannery that gets processed into something else, uniformity is key. And so heirlooms aren't necessarily attractive because sometimes they mature at different times, they have just some variability in them. And that can be great as it allows some flexibility to adapt to the environment. But commercial growers like everything the same, right? Everything has to look the same, be the same size, harvest the same time and whatnot too. And so that's kind of gave rise to the hybrid seed industry. And so hybrids are another type of seed. Just one note, I guess, as you look at different seed packets, you'll rarely see the words open pollinated on seed packets. It's not necessarily like a label given. You do often see labels for heirloom seeds. They get pointed out because that's kind of a marketing ploy too, to kind of indicate it's an old variety. But don't count out if things aren't labeled heirloom. There's a lot of really great work and breeding work done with open pollinated varieties nowadays, especially tomatoes. There's all these great different, like the blueberry tomato and different blue tomatoes. Those are all relatively recent inventions or breeding things, but they are open pollinated varieties. And the word organic, as the example on the right, on seed labels too, means something completely different. If you have an heirloom, it's not necessarily organic. Organic is a label refers to how that seed was grown. And so a lot of people choose organic. It's sort of a choice that helps promote sort of healthy ecosystems and healthy agricultural systems too. But it's not necessarily indicating if you grow seeds that are not labeled organic, like the ones on the left, but you grow in an organic way, meaning you don't use non-approved herbicides and pesticides, you could still call your produce that you're consuming organic. But if you're a commercial grower and want that USDA organic label, you have to choose organic seed if it's available to you. And so it just means that produce that those tomato seeds came from, or those beet seeds, or whatever seed it is, that produce was grown in an organic system. And if it does not have the official inspection and certification of organic, things can be organically grown or naturally grown, but that USDA label comes with lots of bureaucracy and permits and investigation to have that official label. So for example, like I sell seeds that I grow organically in my garden. I don't have USDA certification, so I can't put that label on my seeds, but I do grow them in a natural way and in an organic way. So we can talk more about that if you have some questions, but open pollinated seeds are the ones that you want to save seed from. And so that's kind of in contrast, as I was mentioning, commercial growers wanting more uniformity, wanting more reliability with production, is the development of hybrid seeds, which came about with the Green Revolution in the 1970s and are becoming more and more prevalent in seed catalogs, more and more prevalent for the home garden world. I would say that 75% of seeds are open pollinated that you can find on a seed rack, you know, whether it's Home Depot or a nursery, but more and more becoming are hybrids. And so hybrids are created naturally. They're created in the field. It's not a lab situation with petri dishes. It's created in the field, and it's taking two lineages or two lines that are heavily inbred to create heterosis, which is a thing that happens when two different inbred things come together. Their offspring is productive and amazing and has the best of both worlds of their parents. And so often that's bred for higher yields, but disease resistance, faster maturity, all the things that like commercial growers want. It's a lot of the same things home gardeners want too. I want reliability. I want disease resistance. You know, I want to ensure that I get something for all these inputs of things too. And so corn is kind of the most common thing, a lot of the commercial grains, but more and more tomatoes, peppers, broccoli, are some of the more hybrids that home gardeners can have access to and grow as well. And so you will see the word hybrid with a capital H on those seed packets. And they're often labeled F1, which is filial generation 1. I think in the next one I have some pictures of that. It's generation 1. And so if we were to save seed of anything we grow, so say we grew the Sun King hybrid, which is a great variety for the Phoenix area, it tolerates heat well and is slow to bolt. If we were to save seed from that, it's not necessarily going to resemble its parent, the thing that, you know, the broccoli we saw in our garden. It's going to revert back to one of those parent lineages, one of those inbred lines that may be a beautiful plant that has disease resistance, but not grow a broccoli very well. And so it's very unpredictable and usually disappointing to save seeds from hybrid varieties. Okay, so I grow some hybrids. I love a Super Sweet 100 tomatoes. I love Sun Gold tomatoes. Oh, excellent. Those are hybrids. And so I do not bother with saving seeds of those because it's just unpredictable. They're not going to look like and taste and grow like the beautiful tomato that I ate. it's just going to be kind of an unknown of what genetics are going to come out of that safe seed. So the terminology is that they don't breed true, where the open pollinated varieties will. So you're going to spend time, and energy and effort and storage of seeds. You want to make sure what you're going to plant the next generation is going to look like what you think and taste like what you think as well. And so if you do grow hybrids, just kind of, those are the ones maybe to not spend your time with saving. And the same too, like you'll learn the varieties, like names and stuff too. If someone like turns into the seed library, sun gold tomatoes, for example, they saved from what was grown in their garden. They weren't necessarily working in breeding fields that created the hybrid seed. So there'd be F2 or filial 2 generation, and it may not be very stable. Here's just another like visual example of this. You can also, with open pollinated varieties, I kind of alluded to frankenfruits or something strange. And this is hybrids with like a little case H. Hybrid with the big case H is something that the seed breeding industry and things, there's people whose job is to create hybrid seeds too. But you can also create little H hybrids in your backyard garden unknowingly too. And so that's just from the seeds being allowed to openly pollinate, and you get some cross contamination because there's more than one variety growing of, in this case, squash or tomatoes or something, more than one variety growing. And so those genetics got mixed up between the two. And so sometimes that's cool. That's how we get lots of new varieties, new diversity. It can be great. It often takes many years of ensuring that crossing and sort of breeding, which is a whole nother class we talk about to make sure that it's stable. But sometimes it can be undesirable. A lot of squash that crosses, can get native squash crossing in that creates bitterness and poor growth, poor taste. You just get some undesirable traits and things that aren't good. Weird looking fruits, or the maturity time is off and weird on them with crossing. And so that's why, by sort of understanding some of the botany behind plants and how they breed, how they reproduce, can be useful to kind of avoid that unwanted cross-pollination and frankenfruits, essentially. So I'll kind of give some other examples of that. And so in the first generation, so if we grew butternut and we grew, in the middle is our gyrosperma squash. It's a Navajo gray striped squash, beautiful, like creamy flesh and a great variety. And so if we both grew both of those in our garden, we would get butternuts and we would get the Navajo gray striped squash. It's not unless we save the seed from that butternut or save the seed from the gray striped squash and planted that out that we would get this third picture. And so in that first growing season, if they're growing right next to each other or in the same backyard or in the same field, it's possible there's interbreeding, but what you see in the first generation is the parent plant, is the butternut looking true to type and pure. It's just those seeds are going to be the result of the crossing. So the next generation. So sometimes you don't necessarily know that's happened until you plan out the next season. And then of course, a couple months go by and then the squash start forming and you're like, what? And so I answer a lot of questions sometimes that people are like, oh, I think my things have cross-pollinated and I planted melons next to my cucumber or planted melons next to my squash and I got this like weird thing. It's not that happened in your garden, that sometimes that happens where those seeds came from and were bred. And that crossing can only happen between species. So melons are a different species than cucumbers, and melons are a different species than zucchini squash. And so just like, we're closely related to chimpanzees, but we can't interbreed and make children with chimpanzees. And so it has to be the same species that can create this interbreeding, or extremely closely related species. But so I can answer more questions about that if there are some. Okay, so I know I'm using up a lot of time just to talk about these seeds, but it answers a lot of questions of what you should save. So the other category of seeds, which you know of, are GMO seeds or GE seeds, or genetically engineered. And these are not created in the field. They're created in the lab by actually inserting other genetic material into the crop genetic material. And so this is a very expensive technology. It's something that requires tech, it therefore then has lots of patents on things and protection of those varieties too. And therefore it's really geared towards the commercial agricultural industry, the things that feed, you know, the world, large scale growing. And so people who purchase GMO seeds have a contractual obligation with those, and it costs a lot of money. And it's not something, they are not making GMO seeds in a little $3 packet that you can pick up at Home Depot or a plant nursery. But just the way botany works, GMO seeds growing adjacent or nearby a home garden seeds can result in cross-pollination between things of the same species. And most GMO things are like the commercial crops: cotton, corn, soybeans, canola oil, sugar beets, things, papaya, yellow summer squash, some sweet corns, and things are getting more and more GMO research and development out there. And so there is potential for unwanted cross-contamination between GMO and open pollinated varieties. Okay, so a lot of people ask, like, can I save seeds for my store-bought produce? Well, yes, you can. Just some things to consider is many things when you eat them or when you purchase them at the store to eat are not harvested for seed maturity. They're harvested for eating maturity, which sometimes is very immature seeds. So eggplant, for example, you don't want to buy an eggplant at the store that's full of seeds that you could save, because when they're ready for saving, they're very large and hard and like oversized and things too. So we want eggplant for seeds, like way beyond when it's picked for eating. Often, you know, things are labeled just like yellow pepper or orange pepper, not necessarily the specific variety. So you don't necessarily know or can research, is this something good for my area? Like, what is the variety? We don't, and much produce in the store is not grown for seed. It can be grown alongside lots of varieties and is more grown for production. And so there isn't care taken to ensure the seed is going to be true to type or good quality seeds. And most commercial grocery store produce is hybrids, and increasingly so more and more of it's GMO things. And so it's just very unknown or unstable if that grocery store produce will result in good seed lineage. And often, a lot of times, that isn't locally produced things. Maybe things at a farmer's market are more likely to be open pollinated or to be locally adapted varieties too. But that said, some people have had great success with it. I don't have a million gardening seasons left to kind of play with some stuff like that. So I choose not to save from grocery store produce too. And I think we can invest in quality seed to start with, is one of the best lessons with seed saving. Okay, so moving on to the birds and the bees, kind of how seeds are made, and kind of understanding that will help us ensure that we get good quality seed. So a lot of us choose to grow things that aren't actually seeds that we're saving, but we're propagating. And so what we can save or continue on for other growing cycles is through cloning. And so a lot of plants grow much better from clones than they do necessarily seeds. So some examples of that are potatoes or strawberries. Yes, potatoes do make seeds. Strawberries have seeds, of course, but it's much easier to propagate and take clones of those things to grow the next generation. And it's often much faster too. And so those offspring are clones, genetic clones of their parents. They don't reproduce with sexual reproduction, which is how seeds are produced. And so what you see in the parent is what you get in the child. The picture on the bottom right is very common onion here in the Phoenix area in Arizona is Iitoi onions, named after wild onions found on Iitoi Mountain of the autumn homelands too. And so those propagate. You plant one onion and you get 15, 20 onions at the end of the season, and you just keep continuing planting those onions. So they're genetic copies of their parents too. And so that's those garlic is another one too you can consider as a clone and things too. And so those things are not seed, so for storage of those they're a little more tricky, or things too, just needing to ensure that they are grown the next season. Not something that will keep for like several years. The potatoes would dry up too much to be able to get a viable plant from those things, but definitely consider those are seeds, or are those not in the strict botanical sense, but are things that you can save and continue growing in your area, especially if they're really good. Especially those Iitoi onions, those are fantastic, and everyone should grow those and keep propagating and continuing those in your garden. But for seeds, what we're really talking about is sexual reproduction. So the birds and the bees kind of. And the production of a new living organism, a seed, is really combining the genetic material from two different types of cells, which is male and female. It's kind of how we engendered those different cells. And that's essentially what pollination is. And so once something is successfully pollinated, which means the male pollen makes contact with the female organs of the plant. And when that's successful, it gets fertilized. And those unformed seeds are fertilized and they grow into babies, or into seeds. So I kind of, and throughout this talk, will kind of compare a lot to human anatomy and human reproduction. You can kind of think of it the same thing. If you have children, they're the genetic mixing of a mother and a father create the child. And so the same in the vegetables and flowers and things that we'll save seeds from, is they're the combination of the male and female components of those plants to create the offspring. And so it's a combination of both the male and female. And so with saving seed, what we just want to understand is that the male and female are the parents that we think to create the offspring, the seeds that we want to plant in future seasons. And so again, I'm going to just review, I mentioned that about things can only do this process. They can only sexually reproduce if they're the same species. So here's kind of a taxonomy. And you may, think of things like, did you know that eggplants and potatoes are the same genus, the Solanum genus, as tomatoes? And so as a gardener, that's important because they kind of grow in a similar fashion, have similar needs to them, but they are different species. So you can't get eggplant crossing with a tomato, but you may grow more than one tomato in your garden. You may have all these different varieties in your garden of tomato. And so all the different varieties are the same species. So they have the potential to cross and have, you could have the female Cherokee purple contribution and get some male contribution from Punta Banda tomatoes into your Cherokee purple. And that would create a hybrid of a little h hybrid things. But I'll explain why that's very unlikely to happen in a sec. So this is why when we talk about crossing, we just are worried about crossing within a variety of the same species, not between species. Okay, so this is just a diagram showing Solanaceae is the potato family, or what often includes not just potatoes, but we have the peppers, capsicum genus, the Solanum genus, and the Salus genus is the tomatillos things. So a little bio 101 or even high school bio talking about different parts of a flower. These are the female parts of the flower. And so we always have stigmas on a flower. So if you ever harvested a pepper and you have that little pokey thing at the bottom of the pepper, it's just the dried up stigma. And then the pepper is below it. And that's what's shown here in the diagram as the ovary. That's where the seeds are contained. And so through that process of pollination, this ovary gets fertilized and then that ovary swells, and inside the ovules start to form seeds. And so you probably found when you've harvested fruits, or maybe you've had a watermelon and some of those seeds are just flat little shells and there's no seed. Those are different things that didn't get fertilized. They never were properly fertilized, and so they didn't swell and like grow into an actual seed. So these are the female parts, and getting in the weeds here, you don't necessarily need to do that. And so the male parts are the anthers, and the anthers are what produce the pollen. So when you see the pollen, that's the male part. It's kind of akin to sperm. There's a lot of quantity of it, things too, but that pollen needs to get on the stigma to create fertilization to happen. And so a lot of times that happens in the flower, the same flower, all those parts are there and present, and you don't need to worry about how that happens. The botany and the plant just takes care of that itself. And so why I'm kind of belaboring this or thinking about it is that sometimes that's where you get this cross-contamination or things formed. And so these are the easiest things to save seed from, because we don't need to worry. These are plants that are self-pollinating. They have complete flowers, which means they have both the male and female parts of the flowers and the things, and they don't need any outside intervention. No bees, no wind, no pollinators of any kind to form those seeds. They can do it all themselves. And so what that means too as a seed saver is that those are easier to ensure they're true to type. The tomato you see, the pea you see is what those seeds are going to grow into. So that's the beans, peas, tomatoes, chilies, eggplant, lettuce is another one that's a complete self-pollinating thing. And so these are the easy things to save, and we have no excuse not to go for them. But however, as you see in that picture of that little bee butt is in a bean flower, those little pollinators are everywhere, and they can get in and inadvertently pick up male pollen, fly to another plant that may be another variety of bean, and transfer genetics. And so those fertilized seeds could be a mix of the parent, the mother, the flower it's visiting, and then have some input from the male flower that the bee transferred pollen. So some crossing can happen, but it's much rare in the way these particular species are grown. Some plants have a complete flower. The flower itself has all the male and female parts, but they've adapted, or sort of their genetics make them self-incompatible to each other. So cilantro is one. The cilantro flower, that individual little flower that it's actually like a composite of like each one of those sections is probably 15, 20 flowers. It is genetically impossible for its pollen from the male part of the flower to fertilize the female part of the flower. It rejects its own genes to create more genetic diversity and more strength in its lineage, for example. And so if you've ever let cilantro go to flower, it's super easy for the pollinators to come visit it. And so they're mixing all that around on the flower and sort of making it happen. And so sunflowers are another one that you may not know this. In the flower itself is thousands of individual flowers. We just think of it as one flower, right? The big sunflower, but it's a composite flower, and each one of those seeds is its own flower. And so it's to create more genetic mixing and more diversity in its lineage, it requires pollination, not from a whole nother plant, not from a whole nother sunflower head, but just within that disc, within that sunflower. And so that easily happens as the bees are walking around on there and collecting all that pollen. They're just mixing it up within that flower. And so yes, each flower has its own way to make a seed, but they've just their genes tell them to be self-incompatible to promote cross-pollination between the flowers. I'd love to see a show of hands. Has anyone ever grown tomatillos? And maybe you only grew one plant of tomatillo and got no tomatillos? The tomatillo flower has all the parts to make tomatillos, all the male and female parts, but tomatillos are self-incompatible. They require another plant to genetically mix. So you need another plant, and you need bees to transfer the pollen between plants onto the female parts of the plant to create a tomatillo, to get successful pollination and then successful fertilization and successful growth of seeds. And so that's another one that's a thing that you need at least 2 plants and pollinators to kind of transfer that material. So that makes sense? Yeah, so a lot of gardeners I'm not getting any tomatillos. So that's part of the reason why. And so then there would be no tomatillo seeds to save if you're not getting any. And sometimes there's, you know, mutations or things too that kind of work around these rules of the botany too. And a lot of breeders are picking up on that and trying to promote that sort of thing. So it just makes it easier, because pollinators are hard to come by in many urban environments with colony collapse disorder and other things. The bees are not present. And so people are breeding different varieties to kind of not require the pollinators. So another question, or another type of crops that you may have require cross-pollination because they don't have a flower that has all the necessary reproductive parts. And the one we're probably most familiar with is corn, right? Corn has the male pollen, the tassel at the top of a corn stalk, and the female part is attached to the seed, is attached to the ear of corn. Those are the silks, which are essentially stigmas. I know some of these terms you don't need to necessarily know, but it requires some cross-pollination to occur. And so in corn, that happens with the wind and gravity. Just the pollen falls from the top of the plant down onto those silks. And so if you ever planted corn and you got no kernels, well, what happened is you got no successful pollination or fertilization too. And so those things as a seed saver are just a little like more advanced or a little harder because you need a lot of plants to grow to ensure that they're going to produce the seeds. It's a little trickier to make sure that they stay separate. So if you want to, this is corn, squash, watermelon, cucumbers. So if you want to grow 2 types of squash, like I grow in my garden, I grow zucchini and I grow a yellow. Well, those need cross-pollination just to form the squash. And so those are really hard to keep separate, right? I have to ensure that the bees don't travel between the zucchini and the yellow squash. And so just something to consider as a seed saver, if those things are grown in the same garden, that they won't necessarily, the seeds produced won't necessarily be true to type. The seeds, I would say, would be kind of a mix of the yellow squash and the zucchini because they are the same species. And so with these kind of plants, it's like, oh no, boohoo. We need lots of plants to ensure that adequate male and female flowers are blooming at the same time, so we get some production. And boohoo, we need lots of plants to ensure healthy populations and lots of genetic diversity. And so that's fine for 1 or 2 generations of saving seeds from the corn or from a butternut squash. But over time, it's just not a lot of genetic diversity, and you know, the same thing happens in human populations, that those lineages aren't super healthy. So what you're probably most familiar with is the male and female parts of squash. If you've ever grown squash, the flowers look very different. And here's some examples. Top is cucumber, middle is zucchini, and bottom is watermelon. And so it takes a pollinator to go between the male and female flowers. You as a human can intervene and pick the male flowers and stick them in the female flowers to get that pollination too. And so just these are things to consider as a seed saver, is that the bees free flow between things. So if you have more than one cucumber growing in your garden, it's very likely genetic mixing. And so any seeds saved from those are going to not necessarily be like the parent fruit. Okay. And so the technical term for these plants that have separate male and female flowers is monoecious. So you may see that in some information. So this was in the handouts provided to you. The easy species to save are from the sunflower family, the pea family or bean family, and then the nightshades. Those are really easy to ensure that they'll produce true to type seeds because they have complete flowers and they self-pollinate, and they pollinate even really before the flower is fully exposed and formed. And so these are the beginner level seed saving, where the advanced species are ones that have a lot more crossbreeding happening, and just the way the seeds are produced too can be a little more advanced. And so that's a lot of the brassicas and squash family, and as I mentioned, corn and sort of the grains too. So the difference between male versus female flowers, sorry, the females have essentially an unfertilized fruit, the ovule. So if you look in the photos, the unformed fruit, it looks like a little baby fruit of cucumber, or little baby zucchini or baby watermelon, is the female, where males don't have that at the base of their stem, the base of their flower. None of these pictures are showing the inside of the flower, but the male ones would be covered in pollen on the anther, where the female flower is a stigma that's very sticky, so the pollen will stick to it, but it only has pollen if a bee or something has moved pollen onto that flower. So, but really looking at the base of the flower is how you can see, at least in the squash family. And the corn, of course, is a very different looking plant, but it's got the long silks, are the sticky stigmas that require the pollen. So where the pollen is always male. Okay. So here's another example of kind of showing some of that crossing. Armenian cucumber is a great crop, especially for our arid desert. It's the same species, Cucumis mellow. It's not a cucumber species, it's a melon species. It's the same species as a cantaloupe. And so if we grow those in the same garden, look good, looks like an Armenian cucumber, looks like a cantaloupe. If we were to save seeds of those, the next year's would be a hybrid. That would be a mix of both of those. So not a particularly good cantaloupe or a particularly good Armenian cucumber, sort of a strange mix between them. So that's what, as a seed saver, we don't want this weird thing at the end. We want, so to solve this, you would just grow a cantaloupe or just grow the Armenian cucumbers if you were super serious about saving seed, or focus on saving lettuce and zinnias and tomatoes and other crops that you can't get this hybridization happening. That's why the brassicas, like broccoli, cauliflower, etc., is another one that easily crosses between all these. And so the great thing about growing those, if you wanted to save seed, is that you wouldn't let the broccoli be in flower and producing male and female flowers at the same time as the cauliflower. You'd harvest the cauliflower, eat it, enjoy it, and maybe let some of your broccoli produce seeds. And then there's no other, you may have another plant, the same species growing nearby, but don't let it flower. So, because all of those are the same species, Brassica oleracea. Isn't that fascinating? They look so different. And it's just because people have saved seed by selecting broccoli for its buds and stems, Brussels sprouts for their lateral buds. And this is how we create different stuff, is saving seed targeting different traits. Okay. So this is probably more the meat. What is interesting is how to harvest seed and when to harvest the seed. That's a really important thing. So whether it's broccoli, whether it's peas, whether it's sunflowers, all of these things have to be harvested at seed maturity, not necessarily eating maturity. And so jalapenos, for example, all peppers, eventually will turn red or kind of a brownish red. That's seed maturity, where, you know, for eating, we may want them green. And so that's when the seeds inside are going to be the most swollen, the largest and plumpest and ready for harvesting. Peas, you know, we want them to get, and any kind of bean, we want them to be completely brown outer shell and crispy, and the peas inside to be dry, ready to go. So the bottom right one is okra too. So we want like the okra pod way beyond when we want to eat it, and the seeds inside nice and swollen, no longer edible as they are, things too. So we want all of these plants where the seed is to stay with the mother plant as long as possible. It's very much like human babies. If we, yeah, human babies can be born before 9 months and survive, but that isn't without risk of not everything being fully formed, not everything functioning. And so we want, when we plant those seeds the next generation, we want to make sure that they have nice vigor. They're going to pop right out of the ground. They're going to be healthy and strong. And so seeds have all the storage of energy they need until they're able to grow and photosynthesize and get the light. And so sometimes if they're not fully formed, they don't have enough food. They don't have enough resources to keep them living until they're grown. Because that's something to remember. These seeds are alive. They may not be growing, but they're alive and they're metabolizing. They're breathing in and breathing out the whole time they're in storage, whether that be, just a few months until the next planting, or a few years, or a few generations. They only have what's in their little seed to keep them going. And so we want to harvest them when fully developed and mature, so that they have the best start, and then we'll have the best vigor to them. So those are some examples of some dry seeds. And then essentially it's just separating the seed from the outer coating or the flesh of the pepper or something that is there really to protect the seed for the next generation. So other things, especially, so this is a zucchini, come out from a wet, moist environment. Sorry, I'm just going ahead quick because I have some other slides to answer the question about broccoli, for example. So zucchini, you can see in this looks like this yellow, nasty, overripe zucchini, but for seeds, that's what we want. This is actually an Italian striped, like cockozelle zucchini. So we want kind of some things like squash to be overripe. And then the seeds will be fully formed and hard, just like you'd get out of a seed packet. We don't want it like when you chop up a zucchini and you eat those seeds. We want them fully formed. And so anything like a tomato or zucchini is coming from a moist, wet environment. So it's appropriate to rinse those underwater and continue to have them wet in the process of extracting those seeds before they're put up for storage. Whereas the okra or peas or corn or sunflowers, those are coming from a dry, mature environment. So we never want to get those wet until we were ready to plant them. But the moist, the wet ones, it's totally fine to rinse them off, and actually beneficial because it gets off any goo or things that can mold and cause problems while it's in storage. So here's a quick thing of a screenshot too you could take of tomato seeds specifically. So think about inside a tomato. It's moist, it's warm, it's just ready to germinate, right? It's the conditions seeds needs to grow and germinate. Maybe you've actually had that where a tomato you've opened it and it's got seeds sprouted in it. But you also probably notice when you cut open a tomato, it's got a little gel around each seed. And that gel sac contains hormones that prevent those seeds from growing. And so when you say that, you essentially want to remove that gel sac so that the seeds come up quick. And that can decay in the ground and be fine. So you could, you've had this, right? Those cherry tomatoes drop everywhere. You don't get every single one. And then it grows a whole bunch of tomato plants the next when it's warm again. But if you want to save them, to put them in a nice packet to give to friends or give to the library, things too, you want to do this process of letting them ferment to let that little gel around the seeds to ferment and decompose so that you just have seeds and that they can be put up for storage. So that's just scooping the seeds out, letting it sit there. It'll kind of smell a little, maybe grow some mold. It's not sitting in a lot of water. You want that fermentation to happen, and then rinse them heavily, winnow away all that debris and pulp of the tomato, and then you're just left with viable seeds that sink. And take that off and then rinse them and then dry them. And so this could be the same, not the fermenting, but when you scoop out and rinse pepper seeds or zucchini seeds, butternut squash seeds, anything from melon seeds, rinse them and then lay them out to dry. And in our Phoenix climate, that's no problem to happen at room temperature. It's dry enough in our environment, so we don't need any special dryers or anything to make that happen. In fact, if you use a dehydrator or something with a fan, it's likely going to have heat. And what do seeds need to sprout besides moisture is heat. And so you kind of don't want to treat them with any kind of heat or anything to get them jump started with germinating. So yeah, just these are some I have laying out on a coffee filter or an old paper plate. Especially I like, you probably have some left over from birthday parties, that paper plates that have a little wax coating on them that make them a little stronger, because then the seeds don't stick to it and they just slide right off storage. And usually in our climate here in Phoenix, it only takes 5 to 7 days before you could pack it up and put it inside a little Ziploc or a paper envelope or something to keep it nice and safe. And I can't stress enough the importance of labeling it. In some way, make a label, because you'll find this drying on your counter a week later and you're like, I have no idea what this was that I saved. And so having a label of the variety, but also a label of the day, what's the date that you put it up to dry to, is really useful and important. Some other dry seeds. I'm going to show this picture next and then go back. So sorry for the whiplash on the slides. But someone asked about broccoli. Broccoli, lettuce, cilantro. You may have heard the term bolting. Bolting is essentially when the leafy green plant goes to seed. It starts producing the seed. It's feeling it's near the end of its life. It's stressed out from heat or lack of water or some other environmental condition, and wants to ensure it has the next generation. And so it will go into seed production mode and grow a flower stalk. So this is a picture of a lettuce plant, but the same thing happens to broccoli, etc., other leafy greens. And so it'll grow that stalk, and then that's where the flowers occur. Once those flowers are pollinated successfully, whatever mechanism that is, the seeds will start to swell, and those seeds should be harvested dry. So when they're fully mature is when they're brown and crispy little seed coating or seed husk of the pod. On lettuce, they actually burst open, and you see like they're related to dandelions, like a little puff ball that would take them in the wind and just scatter those seeds everywhere naturally. But you want to get it before that happens. So you take the little puff ball and then put it in a paper bag or something to keep the seeds safe and collected rather than sitting out there. And so from the time that it starts to bolt and create the flowers, it's at least a month or more before those seeds are viable on all of these species listed here. And so as a seed saver, that could take up a lot of space that you want to give things the boot to plant something else. It can take a lot of time. Those things can be vulnerable for that month. The birds could descend and eat all of your arugula seeds as they're maturing. Other critters, can damage the plant. It can be so hot that the plant just totally dies before the seeds even get mature. And so those plants still need water and care while they're maturing. So it is something to consider, that it does often take a long time. And so you don't want to, there's no, on this stage of the lettuce, there's no seed formed yet. The flowers are just coming out. It'll be several weeks before the seeds are pollinated, and then a couple more weeks as they fully mature. So then what we would do is we'd harvest those things. We would do threshing to kind of separate the seed pod from the seed itself. That's what threshing is, by crushing, stomping, beating, rubbing between your hands, things too. And then we'd want to winnow away. So the chaff and the seed pod bits and other debris is usually very light, where seeds, if they're viable, are very heavy. And so they'll kind of fall down and be heavier. And so just like this gentleman here with the fan, I kind of do a lot of that, or I use the natural wind or something to kind of carry away the little debris. And then I'm left with the heavier seeds below. You can keep the seeds in the pots. That's fine. It's just hard to know how many seeds there are. They're viable. And so when you go to plant, it can be hard to space things out or quite know too. And like with this lettuce is going to produce this one plant. If you got every single seed before birds or wind or things took it away, you'd probably be left with 6 ounces of seed. 6 ounces of lettuce seed would feed the whole city of Glendale. Maybe not, but it's a lot of lettuce seed. A packet, you know, probably has 200 seeds in it. And that's probably more than most home gardeners can eat. So you don't necessarily need every little seed that can be on a plant too. And so as you collect and get some, then you'd be like, okay, I think I have plenty. Then you can take out the bolted plant too. So same with like cilantro, those little seeds that form, don't harvest them when they're green. They need to be brown as a sign of maturity. It'll be dry and fully mature. Same with basil. Basil will just keep flowering and growing and growing, but the lower flowers at the stalk are going to be the first ones to fertilize, and they'll be mature first before the top ones. And so again, one basil plant can produce easily 6 ounces of basil seed. That's probably way more than what you'd ever want in your whole life. And so I have lots of gardening friends to give it to, but you don't necessarily need to get every single thing. And so some more examples. So lettuce grows like a tree, and then it'll have the flowers at the top. And that whole process, just to get to the picture, is like often 3 or 4 weeks, and then a whole nother month for the seeds to be mature. Radish is the one in the middle. And then, boy, look at the beets gone to seed on the right. Same look for Swiss chard. Swiss chard and beets are actually the same species. So again, what does that mean? They can interbreed and cross-pollinate very easily. So beets get very wild and unruly, and it's kind of hard to keep that kind of monster in your garden too. So that's something to consider, is the space things. And so then on all those, when you have the chaff things too, this is showing, this happens to be wheat, but all of that. So like the basil, when you have the dry flower stem and stalk, you would just use some of these everyday kitchen tools, and your hands are the best tool, and sort of thresh it. You could put stuff on a tarp or in a Rubbermaid tub or something and stomp on it. And you just want to kind of release the seeds from the pods, from the chaff. And then they'll be heavy and they'll fall to the bottom. And then all the loose chaff stuff will be lighter and come to the top. And so you just kind of using between 2 bowls and using the natural wind, you can separate things. And again, you don't have to necessarily have 100% seed and no little bits of chaff, but that chaff can also be mixed in with bugs or bug eggs or things that can damage the seed, or if it harbors moisture, can mold the seed. So you want to clean out as much as you can. So, and how do you know if the seeds you saved are any good? Because it can be hard to tell if they're mature or not, or are they going to grow the next year. And so a simple test is to do just an easy germination test at home with a wet paper towel. So you count out a certain number of seeds. You know, you can do 10, you can do 50, you know, however many seeds you want to kind of sacrifice for this purpose, but write down how many you put in there, because then you'll loosely wrap it in a moist paper towel, add it to a Ziploc or something that's not going to dry out. You want it to stay consistently moist. So don't close it either, because seeds also need oxygen a little bit. And so if it's totally closed and sealed, it's going to just ferment, and you're not going to want to open that paper towel. Place it in a warm location, especially if it's more warm season things like celery, for example, only germinates in the cool weather. And so it kind of depends on the seed. And then check it and then just count how many grew. And so then you can also see, are they molding or getting some gross, disgusting stuff on it, or something, then it's not quality seed. But hopefully you get really good germination. Most seeds that are sold it all depends on the species, germinate between 60 and 80% is acceptable rates to be legally sold. But hopefully you get 90+% of them germinating to be good. Is that too, if you happen to come across like really old seeds and you're like, oh, I don't know if these are any good, you can kind of do this little test on some to see. And some people use this, and then you don't have to throw away this melon or cucumber seed. You could actually plant that if the season is right to do it too. So once you have your safe seeds, the best practice, and I know I'm dragging on here, but I want to answer these questions, is what do you do with your seeds? And this is the same rules if you purchase seeds or have seeds in your home, is to always store somewhere that's cool, dark, and dry. So essentially we want to have the conditions that are opposite of what makes seeds grow: moisture, heat, light. So we kind of want to minimize those. And so as I mentioned, seeds are living, they're breathing, they're metabolizing. And so we want to slow down that metabolism so they last longer. It all depends on, if you don't have good seed going into storage, you won't have good seed coming out of storage. And so, so harvesting the seed when it's mature, and you want the seeds to have plumpness to them. They shouldn't be flat and sort of look like there's nothing there to germinate and grow. And you want the seeds to be dry. And so that can be a hard thing to tell. Is it dry enough? But like on a squash seed that's a bigger seed, you should be able to snap it in half. And it should snap in half and it shouldn't bend. I mean, obviously basil and lettuce and things are very tiny seeds, so that's harder to tell. But you can also use those little silica packs that come with shoes, you know, to keep them dry and shipment and stuff. You can throw those into your seed just to absorb any extra moisture. Too, you can actually purchase some of that you can dehydrate and use again over and over again. If you're in I would say in Arizona, we're not in a humid place by any means, so it's not as essential to ensure things are as dry, because it's very dry here. But in Minnesota, where it's like 90% humidity all the time, that's something that you need, kind of these extra measures. And so you can store in all kinds of things. This is my seed box of my active seeds that I use in the garden. Is just plastic boxes, and then inside I have paper bags, I have plastic bags, little baggies that, you know, jewelry or things are sold in and stuff too. Label is what I would say too, not just with what it is, but when it was. Like, when did you harvest the seed? How old is it actually? Seeds last a long time. And so if you saved quality seed, it was mature when it was harvested, things too, it can live for a decade or more. It's a misnomer that seeds only have a year life to them. I mean, if they're stored in cool, dark, and dry, they can live for a long time. And maybe the germination rate will go down slightly over time, of course. Yeah, so a lot of the short-lived things, spinach especially is really short-lived, and parsnip. And pepper germination really can nosedive, but that's still like, we're talking spinach 2 to 3 years, peppers like 5 to 7 years. If stored well, the broccoli brassicas range is still like a 3 to 5 year range. But cucumber, squash, tomato, all those is like a decade or more easily. And sometimes those could be 50, 60 years. But the idea is that too, you're not hopefully waiting that long to plant and get a new seed too. But don't think it's something that, you know, it only lasts a year. And using that germination info can be helpful. So jotting that down on the envelope too, just so you kind of have a sense of like, oh, these weren't really great. You know, I was getting pretty low germination to begin with. I should grow these again, or, you know, stuff. So, and then in the handout too, you guys received some books and information as well, and some other resources. Seed Savers Exchange has amazing resources, online guides, and they have like a 300-page book if you're super serious. That has beautiful pictures and wonderful things called The Seed Garden. And then I'm gonna stop sharing for a sec. And then this is the book. I guess I have my weird thing on the book that I wrote with Native Seed Search and my friend Joy. That's just a quick, easy reference guide on saving seeds too. It has some drawings in it. And then of course, if you have a specific question too, you're always welcome to email me. So, but I do want to address all the questions in the chat. So.
Yay, thank you so much, Melissa. I want to put a pun for a seed-tacular presentation.
Love that. Thank you. Awesome. Love that.
So engaging. Just love the photos. I just love that your passion for explaining seed saving, and that we do need to have some of the biology background too to know that we're, harvesting the best type of seeds for our garden.
Well, and that's the one thing about the virtual format is if we were doing this in person, I would have like lettuce seeds to see, you could see and touch and feel these things, and or have basil seeds or squash or things too. So hopefully without having that tactile experience too, you can get see how these things would grow. So
hey, thank you. So I've accumulated some questions. I noticed that saw some of the questions throughout the presentation. So I know you've touched upon like the broccoli, how to grow the broccoli, and then about the basil, about how to get the seeds from the basil pods, and shaking them out so they're heavier than the lighter fluff that might be mixed in. And you kind of touched upon answering this one when you were showing the lettuce growing. But one of the questions was if the seed isn't mature yet because gopher ate the roots of the plant, and if is there something we can do about it to mature the seed if gophers are eating the roots of the plant?
Yeah, and that can happen, not just gophers, just other things, or maybe, you need that space in your garden. And so sometimes the best thing, if like the lettuce, you can have the whole plant with the flowers too, is you can harvest early. Same with sunflowers, and the birds are always right on those sunflowers. They know when they're mature, or the little finches are always eating the basil. Is if you take the whole plant, like the whole mother plant, and still leave the seeds attached, it can still draw energy and resources from that. And so you could put it in a paper bag and maybe just hang it up in the garage or somewhere to kind of after mature, or get a little bit more maturity on it too. And those zucchini I showed that were yellow, or eggplant, when they're starting to turn yellow and hard, you can take them out and keep them inside, and then just leave them on the counter for a couple more weeks. Is extra maturity time to let it kind of after mature too. So, but I know with a lot of those dry crop things, it's like hard to have that space devoted, because right now I have some lettuce that I just fell in love with, I want to do, but it's like, that's like, I want to plant my spring stuff and stuff. And so, but you really got to make sure that fertilization has already happened. We're talking about just you can see the pods, or see the seed pods have formed, and then extra after ripening, and you could do by hanging them up. So but sometimes that can, and you'll kind of know if like broccoli, for example, is the seed, or arugula, if the seed is brown and not black, it's not there. It may not, they may grow some, but the germination will be lower. It just might not have as much vigor stuff to them. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Another question that came through is, I need a recommendation for fertilizer / soil additive. I've been growing for 20 plus years, and each year my crop is less and less.
Yeah. And so all that mass that you grow, all the biomass that comes out of the garden and stuff too, has to come from somewhere. And so it's taking from the soil. And so at some point there isn't any more that the soil has to give, because you've taken it all and eaten it. And so every year should have additives to it, whether that be compost. I'm a big fan of steer manure because it's cheap. And it's a good additive, and it's high in nitrogen. A lot of what you harvest and see is nitrogen is kind of the main component. But other all-purpose fertilizers have nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Those are kind of the main things. And so every time you plant, of adding a fertilizer too will help. There's lots of great organic things on the market made, from chicken manure is another great thing. Even taking a cycle off and doing a cover crop of peas, or a cover crop of some other legume, and then when it's a couple inches tall, you sort of chop it up and mix it into the soil, can add it can bring up a lot of nutrients to it. And home composting is obviously much more popular, and lots of resources out there to have your own compost bin at home, all your own food scraps, the debris you're clearing from the garden. So I don't know if you guys have thought about a composting class with this series, but compost really retains water, and they're like little sponges. All that organic matter are like little sponges and hold water in the soil. And so it's a great water saving strategy too, to make sure your soils have lots of good organics and compost in it too. And then locally made is good with compost as well as seeds. So.
Yeah, we had a composting class. I believe it was fall 2020. So when you all fill out your survey, this is a reminder to fill out the survey. If you want us to bring that class back, please include it in the survey so I know if there's enough interest to bring it back. But yeah, very good.
And I would say, yeah, I'm a huge fan of vermicomposting, which is worm composting. And kind of if you build it, they will come attitude. I have one of my in-ground beds are full of earthworms now that I've been gardening it in a while, and they're decomposing and creating little tunnels and things in the soil. And then I have other species of worms that eat my food scraps, and then their poop is what I spread around the garden. So
awesome. Well, right now I think I've answered all the questions that were added since you've answered a lot through the presentation, but I'm just going to read the nice comments. But if anyone in the audience has some like burning questions, ask them now and type away at the keyboard. But yeah, Melissa, a lot of people were saying, thank you, Miss Melissa, a ton of great information, green thumbs up. New to gardening, I really enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for a good presentation. Love all the info. Thank you. Looking forward to another. Okay, oh, we have some comments here. Maybe about soil preparation in the Southwest, all natural. Ooh, very good. So a lot of great comments. So many people just enjoyed all the information you provided. And if you joined the presentation late, I do have a few closing reminders. So our next class in our Green Living series will be Savvy Succulent Spaces, and that'll be offered in person at the Glendale Main Library. And it'll be on April 16th, which is a Saturday, from 10 to 11:30 a.m. And you will receive tonight, if you joined in, you'll receive a follow-up email with the PowerPoint. It'll include the link to the recording, which will be up in about a week. And then again, a link to the survey. And so I noticed someone asked for the survey in the chat. So please fill that out again. If you fill out that survey, you will be entered in for a chance to win a gift card to a local nursery. So please fill that out. We really value your feedback. I don't see any additional questions in the chat, but like Joanne did in the beginning of the presentation, and included Melissa's email. So if you think of any questions, you know, tonight or tomorrow, you're just like brooming with like, ooh, I just want to get my seed collection started, and I just have something that you want to ask, feel free to reach out to Melissa as well. But I just appreciate everyone joining us tonight on your evening, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening. And yeah, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. This was just a great, great workshop, and I just appreciate all the insight and knowledge that Melissa provided tonight.
Yeah, and I'll just close by saying, I know we talked about the seed library, but I think with the last couple of years with COVID, there hasn't been as many seed exchanges or like a public gathering to just everyone bring your seeds and meet other gardeners and stuff too. And that's a great way to build your seed collection and get local seeds too. And so hopefully we're on the track to have more of those kind of garden gatherings and stuff too. And so I always post if I'm attending one of those via my website and stuff too, but I don't have anything on the horizon quite yet. But I'd love those events, not just for the seeds, but just for the community and getting to know other gardeners.
Yeah, I just love like, yeah, the network, the community, and just sharing insight and just saying like, oh, someone like grew this from their own garden, and these are the seeds I get to enjoy now. It's, you know, taking shape into my garden. So just love the stories and the transformation of a backyard, and just how something so small as a seed can have such big impact on us all. So very good. Well, I want to wrap up, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, we'll be providing the recording and the follow-up email along with the slides and the survey. I included the survey in the chat, but again, it'll also be included in the follow-up email too if you weren't able to copy and paste it. But thanks, everybody. And then until next time.